Hello and welcome to Law Excellence Hyderabad and Bangalore. This is the news analysis for 25th April 2020 brought to you by Law Excellence. So the discussion for the day has been divided into two parts. Deep is basically consisting of those articles which figure out in the editorial, so we call it as daily editorial enrichment program. The rest of the important articles have been clubbed under targeted news analysis. Now let's move on to our discussion. So the first article for our discussion is titled No 100% Quota. The syllabus connection for the same is under Indian Polity and Governance, Institutions for Vulnerable Sections and so on. What is the issue here? The issue is related to the reservation that is provided for certain jobs. Back in 2000, Andhra Pradesh government has basically passed a government order which basically reserved 100% of the seats for school teacher jobs to be occupied only by scheduled tribe people in areas of in scheduled areas. That is what this order basically said. And regarding this order, Supreme Court has passed a judgment, and then there is some analysis related to it. That is what this article is trying to tell us. So, like I just mentioned, the Andhra Pradesh government order of January 2010 basically tried to reserve all the seats that are there for government jobs, for government school teacher jobs in scheduled areas to be occupied only by people belonging to scheduled tribes. What does this mean? If there is a teacher job that is present in scheduled areas, that can be occupied only by a scheduled tribe person. That is what the government order said. And in addition to this, 33% of the number of jobs that are there, they shall be going to women in order to provide due representation for women. This was the government order that has been passed. Now we all know that representation is basically a tool to make sure to uplift certain sections of the society. But if you look at this particular order, it is trying to reserve all the seats that are there, all the jobs that are there for a particular community, and that is what is being contested in this particular article, or be it in the Supreme Court judgment. So why did Andhra Pradesh government pass this government order as such? Because of the following reason. During that time, there used to be a case of chronic absenteeism, especially in teachers who did not belong to the scheduled tribes. So what does this mean? If you look at the teacher presence in those areas of scheduled areas, the number of teachers who belong to non-scheduled tribes, the number of teachers who belong to either open category or backward classes and so on, they did not attend the school much. So they did not go to the school and teach people. So this is to say that Andhra Pradesh government has felt that by giving more representation to the people who are more committed to the development of scheduled tribe areas, it is wise to give 100% reservation to these particular people, this particular community of scheduled tribes. Now this particular government order has been totally struck down by Supreme Court by saying it is unconstitutional, and the Supreme Court judgment basically has certain valid arguments behind them. Those arguments are given by this particular article. The first point is that it is not at all permissible. Why is it not permissible? The amount of reservation that you give is only so much to protect certain communities. In order to protect certain communities, or in order to uplift certain communities like scheduled caste, scheduled tribes and so on, you give reservation so that after 2 or 3 generations these people will do not face the stigma that they are facing now. But that is the only motive of reservation, and by providing reservation to 100% reservation to a particular community, you are basically neglecting the other communities. You are basically preventing the other communities from accessing these jobs. That is first point. And if you do that, it is basically a violation of Article 14 and Article 16, Article 15 of the Constitution. All these three articles are violated because they talk about equality as such in public employment or equality in general. So all these things are violated. In addition to this, what else is the problem with this particular government order? It is also the case that there is something called the Indira Sawhney judgment. The Indira Sawhney judgment says that the reservation cannot extend 50 to 51%. Your reservation cannot be more than this percentage. But if you give 100% reservation to a particular community, you obviously are crossing this threshold. So as per Indira Sawhney judgment, your government order is also invalid. In addition to this, one important reason that we can think of if we analyze it from political science angle, think about it this way. The idea of reservation is to provide due representation to all the communities that are there. in order to make sure that any government entity that we take, be it the body of teachers, be it the body of public servants, be it the body of students, etc., etc., the idea of providing reservation is to make sure that this body, whichever it is, of students or teachers or whatever, this is representative of the society at large. And that is only possible if you give only proportional kinds of seats to these people and not 100% reservation to a particular community. So the idea of due representation is reflected only when you give reservation only in certain percentages, which is proportional to their population in that particular area or the society or the country. Now that is also being violated by this particular government judgment. So for all these reasons, the Supreme Court has cited that this is totally unconstitutional and that we are striking down the order. And some articles that are relevant from this particular point of view is basically Article 51A, because it talks about equality of opportunity and pursuit of choice. And the second article which is important is Article 14, which talks about equality before law. Next comes Article 15(1), which talks about discrimination against citizens, and Article 16, which talks about equal opportunity in terms of public employment as given by the Constitution. So that is what this article is trying to tell us. What is the essence of the article? The essence of the article is that the idea of due representation has to be followed. But in the case of Andhra Pradesh government, what was the main problem? The problem was that people belonging to open category or the backward classes community or the other communities, they were not basically attending the school or teaching the kids as such. There was chronic absenteeism. So in order to solve this, the key is not to give 100% reservation to scheduled tribes, but use other methods, but use other means in order to ensure their presence, probably by biometric attendance, probably by linking their salary to the number of days present, and so on. So that is how you are supposed to do it, but not give 100% reservation or any other measure like that, because it is going to hurt the concept of equality. So this is the first article. Now let's move on to the next article. So the title of the present article is Joining of Giants. This is related to the investment that is being done by Facebook in the shares of Reliance Jio. And this article basically talks about the same. In relation to the syllabus, we can place it under Indian economy. The issue, dimension and learning objectives we will see as we move forward. Now let us look into the article. So what is the context of the article? Facebook has decided to invest about 43,574 crores in Reliance Industries Limited in Jio platforms. This is about 9.9% of the stake of Reliance Industries. So what does this basically mean? This means that Facebook is trying to pump in money and buy shares of this Reliance industry, and by doing so it will be able to get some amount of ownership, precisely 9.9% of the ownership, because that is the amount of money it is basically investing. So basically these two giants have come forward, and the impact of the same is basically trying to be discussed by this particular article. Then in relation to retail sector, this article says that the coming together of these two giants is going to probably hurt the retail sector as such. And the retail space as such is basically unorganized at the moment. Like for example, we have several number of players here, like Amazon, we have Walmart, etc., etc. All of them are trying to basically create distribution chains in the country in order to supply goods, in order to move goods from one point to another. But this retail space is basically mostly unorganized, except for one or two players like Amazon, Walmart, Flipkart, etc. Flipkart of course has been basically subsumed now. So except for these one or two players, the retail space is mostly vacant, and vacant in the sense unorganized. And the coming together of these two giants might cause a problem, because these two might create a situation of monopoly, is what this article is trying to tell us. Like for example, how can this come about? Like for example, Facebook is strongly known for what? For its social media and messaging services. It is very famous in most of the people in the country, especially in the youth of the country. So Facebook will be able to market the goods that are there by producing ads of certain goods and so on, and Reliance will be able to provide the distribution and supply chain that is required to dominate the retail space. So one of them is going to act as the marketing person, and the other person is going to provide the hardcore logistics, and together they are probably going to dominate the retail space. That is one concern. And the second concern is probability of becoming it is the probability of internet becoming more costly. Like for example, some time ago, maybe 2 or 3 years ago, Facebook really wanted to come into India in the form of free basics. It wanted to provide select internet services for free, but people said that this is going to hurt the concept of network neutrality or net neutrality, because it might hurt the poor in poor disproportionately. That was basically something that has been pointed out at that point of time. That is not relevant, but what is relevant for this particular discussion is that when Facebook tried to come into the country through the channel of network through the channel of free internet, conditional free internet and so on, basically it faced difficulty to enter into India because of our strong regulatory mechanism. But now that problem is being overcome by Facebook, because now it is trying to come in a hard manner. It is trying to invest in Reliance Jio, and slowly, once the monopoly is established, this might cause a situation in which there will be an increase in price rise of basic internet services. So these are the two concerns this article is trying to tell us. First is the domination of retail chain and the creation of monopoly, and second, in the telecom sector itself, this might lead to an increase in increase in the prices of internet services eventually. And most importantly, what is the importance of deal for these particular countries, these particular companies? Firstly, Facebook will be able to access more number of people, because Reliance Jio has a good number of consumers, good number of subscriptions under it. So Facebook will be able to connect to these people, and obviously it will increase its market. On the second hand, on the other hand, what is the importance of this particular deal for Reliance Jio? Obviously the money that is coming in, because telecom sector as such is not doing well at the moment. Most of the telecom companies are going under debt. They are basically reeling under a lot of debt. In this situation, if a particular giant is basically pumping you about 45,000 crores into your company, it is going to hurt you or help you? It is definitely going to help you. So that is how these two giants are benefiting. There is going to be a case of mutual benefit. Now the concept is to make sure that this deal will help the people. In order to do this, we have to make sure that our regulatory mechanism is better enough to make sure that these two people won't do anything wrong. We have to prevent their monopoly. We also have to prevent the case in which they will be able to hike the internet prices. In order to do so, we have to make sure that our regulatory mechanism is modified, or is made suitable to this particular deal. So some basic changes in the regulatory mechanism are required. This is also something the article tries to point out. So let's move on to the next discussion. This is what the gist of this article is. So that title of the present article is Troughs and Crests in Pandemic Response. So this is basically related to international relations, effects of policies and politics of developed and developing countries on India's interest, and from the point of view of governance, it can also be seen under important aspects of governance. Now let us try to understand what this article is trying to tell us. So basically, this article is trying to tell us the following. We see the development of a certain nationalistic turn in the world over. What is it? What does it mean actually? Different countries are trying to look inwards. They are saying that we want to protect our population, so immigration will be stopped for the most part. For example, USA has said, Mr. Trump has passed an executive order which said for the next 60 days we are not going to USA is not going to allow any legal immigrant to come into their country. In addition to this, several other countries are trying to point fingers at each other, saying that corona has come to our country from you, and all the countries together and in unison are trying to point their fingers at China by saying that China is basically the cause of all this. All this is fine. China might be the cause of this problem, but the article basically is trying to tell that this is not the time to do that kind of bickering. This is not the time to do that pointing fingers wala game. You are supposed to basically come together and come up with a multi-dimensional strategy which consists of international cooperation in order to handle this pandemic, because COVID-19 is not a normal problem. This is basically a global scale problem, and during this time, if these countries do not work in unity, do not come together and come up with a strategy to handle it, then it will be really difficult to handle this problem of COVID. That is what this article is trying to tell us. So this article basically tries to identify the different stages of response in relation to the COVID. First is, if you look at different countries that are there, there is difference in the way in which they have responded to COVID. Like for example, some countries have identified the importance of locking down very early. Like countries like South Korea and so on, they have been basically using the method of lockdown and rapid testing and so on in order to make sure that the COVID curve is flattened as such, so that the cases of doubling of COVID decrease by a large amount. This has worked in some countries, but most countries, what have they done? They basically did not try and act at the right time, because of which a lot of people, a lot of their citizens have been affected. So this is the first problem which countries faced. They were not keen on recognizing the importance of incoming threat. This is the first problem that the article is pointing out. And the second thing is that the countries are also not able to deburden the economy. And what does it mean by this? The countries are basically trying to put in a lockdown restrictions. They are trying to shut down the companies for a temporary period until and unless this COVID totally gets handled and so on. Because of this, the businesses have been shut up for all practical purposes. And in order to reopen these businesses, in order to create a measured return of these businesses to a working capacity, it is basically causing some kind of difficulties. Because even if I were to lift a lockdown, how will what industries will I allow, what industries will I not allow? Even if I were to allow some industries, what are the social distancing norms that will be followed in that particular industry? Will I make, if there is a textile industry for example, will I allow all the people in the textile industry, all the laborers, to come at once and continue their jobs? That is not possible, because social distancing is very important. COVID is still impacting a lot of people in the country. So a measured return of businesses to normalcy is also another problem that the countries are facing. That is one problem that the article is trying to point out. And thirdly, there is this concept of mass vaccination program. Firstly, there is no vaccination as yet for COVID-19, but mass vaccination program, if it is to be done, how do we do it, and what is the strategy for it? All this is basically in the gray area, and no country has any clear idea about all these things. So basically this article tries to gauge the different kinds of responses that are being given by different countries to this common problem of COVID. And instead of handling this problem in unity, they are basically trying to point fingers at each other, and this is causing a problem. This is basically decreasing the pace at which we are able to fight COVID as such. So in order to do this, the article basically says that you have to follow certain measures. Firstly, there has to be the concept of multi-dimensional international cooperation. That is one thing. And secondly, you have to have a strong political will. You have to have a strong political will. Do not take into account any other consequences. Like for example, मेरा economy down हो जाएगा, my economy will not do well, so I will not go for lockdown. Don't do these kinds of things. You basically have to make sure that you do everything that is possible in order to handle the system as such, in order to handle the COVID problem as such. If it is required for you to lock down, please lock down. That is something you have to do. And then lastly but not leastly, we have seen that COVID-19 has exposed the problems in the public health sector. Like for example, in developing countries, they have not been able to handle the COVID cases because they simply did not have enough testing kits, first thing. And secondly, even if they had testing kits, they did not know where to place these COVID patients. Do they place them in the normal hospitals, or do they place them in a separate ward? And even if they were to place them in a separate ward, are there enough hospitals to handle it? Are there enough government hospitals to handle it? Simply no, because in developing countries the health infrastructure is not so good. So basically COVID-19 has exposed these flaws of certain developing countries. So countries altogether have to basically make sure that they handle all these problems uh, handle this problem of COVID. So basically overall, what is this article trying to tell us? Article is trying to tell us that different countries have different responses, which is fine. They have to come together and put up a coordinated effort instead of pointing fingers at each other or pointing fingers at China, because this is not the time to do so. This is the time to basically fight the problem. Now let's move on to the next article. So the title of the present article is No Plan to Ease Fiscal Deficit Targets, and the syllabus connection for the same has been listed here. Under GS2, it can be placed under Indian polity, devolution of powers and finances, and so on. Please have a look. Now let's look into the discussion of this article. So before we jump into this article, we need to have a basic understanding about the FRBM Act, the recent FRBM Act that has been passed. The recent as in 2003 itself, FRBM Act, Fiscal Responsibility Budget Management Act has been passed, but this has been amended to suit the needs of the time. This has been amended in recent times, and certain amendments have been made. So what is the concept of Fiscal Responsibility Budget Management Act? With that background, we will be able to understand this article. So what is this FRBM Act? So basically government every year gets some incoming money, we call it as the income, and then the government uses this money and spends it on people, infrastructure, social sector, and so on. That is called the expenditure of the government. There is a difference, of course, between the income and the expenditure. This difference is basically called as the fiscal deficit, and this difference is basically negative, in the sense the expenditure is always higher compared to the income, and this basic pothole is basically filled by taking money either from the RBI or externally or internally. We generally do not take money from the outside world. So in general, whatever difference is there, this difference of fiscal deficit has to be filled by borrowing from the market. So anyway, that is the concept of fiscal deficit. So fiscal responsibility budget management basically tries to curtail this deficit. It tries to control this fiscal deficit, because if we take a lot of money from the market, it is going to create a set of problems. Like for example, firstly, in order to handle my fiscal deficit, I am the government here. If I'm supposed to handle the fiscal deficit, I borrow a lot of money from the market, then the corporate people will not have enough money to borrow from the market. So there is this problem of crowding out of investment. That is one problem. And secondly, if I keep taking too much money, will I be able to pay back? No. And anyway, even if I take lots of money, who is going to pay back after 5 or 6 years? That is going to be some other government, right? So this government basically takes up the money. It is going to take the money in the form of loan from the market or from wherever, but the money that is being paid as interest is basically probably being done by some other government. So this is also a violation of some natural law that is there. So in order to handle all these problems, there are of course several other problems with a very high fiscal deficit. In order to handle all these problems, fiscal deficit has to be curtailed, and in order to curtail it, we have passed a law called the Fiscal Responsibility Budget Management Act. So, Fiscal Responsibility Budget Management Act says that you have to keep your fiscal deficit within a percentage range. Like, for example, you have to keep it up to 3% by 2020, 22, and 23, and so on. Like this, certain figures have been made. But Fiscal Responsibility Budget Management, or FRBM Act, basically allows you to invoke the escape clause in case of natural calamities, in case of disasters, or in case of some impending problem. You can deviate from your fiscal deficit target by about just 0.5%, right? So that is what this article is trying to tell us. This article is basically telling us that recently the chairman of the 15th Finance Commission has said that there is no plan to basically invoke the escape clause for the next year, because the escape clause has already been invoked in the current year. That is what this article is trying to tell us. So we won't keep on invoking the escape clause, because we are already using the escape clause to basically pump in money. So if we pump in money, so basically we will try to stick to the targets within the range of the escape clause. That is what this article is trying to tell us. Now comes the problem of states. A lot of states are basically demanding relaxation in the fiscal FRBM targets, simply because they do not have enough money to handle themselves really well. In such a situation, the article basically tells that the states should invoke their own escape clauses, and in order to do that, they should enact a separate law for it, and by doing so, they can invoke their escape clauses and they can deviate from their fiscal deficit targets, and with that money, they should be able to revive their economies. That is what this article is telling us. In addition to all this, the growth rates have to be revised downwards. Like for example, previously we have said that India is probably going to grow at 4.5 to 5%, but now that is definitely not possible because of lockdown, because of the shutdown of different businesses that are there. So we have to revise our growth rates downwards considerably. That is what this article says. And now that it has pointed out the issues that are there, that is related to the escape clause of the government, that is related to the escape clause of the state governments, and that which is related to the growth rates, it basically gives us a way forward. The first way forward is to come up with a very strong and smart fiscal response. We have to come up with a fiscal stimulus package. Now, what is a fiscal stimulus? A fiscal stimulus is basically a measure that is taken by the government in order to increase the spending of the people through whatever means. It is basically trying to urge or encourage people to spend more. And this is possible if the government makes sure that people have enough disposable income in their hand. And one way to do it is by decreased taxes, of course. And whatever be the way, sometimes you decrease taxes, sometimes you give subsidies, and so on. Fiscal stimulus is a case in which the government makes sure that people have a lot of money in their hand. This we call as high disposable income. Once they have high disposable income in their hands, they are going to consume more, and this consumption is going to drive the demand, and this will drive the businesses, and this is going to create a virtuous loop of good business, good investment, good production, and good GDP overall. So this kind of fiscal stimulus package is definitely needed. That is the first point. And secondly, the small enterprises, whatever fiscal stimulus package you have to give extra care, you have to give extra importance to the small enterprises, because they basically employ a lot of people, and they are basically facing the biggest problem now because of the lockdown. So these people have to be given extra care, is what this article is trying to tell us. And that should be this gist of this particular article. Now let's move on to the next article. So the title of the present article is India must be self-reliant, says Prime Minister Modi. This has mostly pre-relevant facts. Let's quickly go through them. The syllabus connection has been given here. It comes under GS2, governance and e-governance. So this article basically talks about the recent speech that has been given by Prime Minister. As we all know, different countries are trying to handle COVID in different ways. But whatever be the case, the movement of people across countries has decreased to a large extent. In fact, it has stopped for all practical purposes, and globalization has come to a standstill. In this context, it is really important to understand the importance of self-reliance. That is what the article says, and I mean that is what Mr. Modi says. Mr. Modi says that the biggest message of COVID-19 is that we have to understand the importance of self-reliance and the concept of self-sufficiency. And this self-sufficiency is not just at a national level. It is not just at a national level that we decide whether we are secure in terms of food, whether we are secure in terms of the economic activity that is there, whether we are secure in terms of the production of goods and services. Not just at the economic level, we also have to gauge this at a state level, at village level, at district level, and at all levels. At all the successive levels, each unit has to be strongly and very strongly self-sufficient, is what this speech has been said. And the relevant facts for the prelims are the following. On Panchayati Raj Day, the Prime Minister has launched two important initiatives. The first important initiative is E-Gram Swaraj. E-Gram Swaraj, this is important for prelims, please concentrate. So E-Gram Swaraj is basically for maintaining rural infrastructure works. For monitoring rural infrastructure works, you basically have this e-gram swaraj. This is basically a measure of e-governance. And the second important thing is basically the program called Swamitwa is the program. This basically does what? It basically maps the rural housing that is there. Whatever rural housing is there, I am going to map them. I am also going to map the land holdings of different people that are there. And how do I do it? I do it using technology. I do it using information technology and even drones as such. By this way, I am going to map the rural housing and then the land holding. This is going to help me understand the resources that are being used, and also the land holdings and the land titlings of that particular rural area. So these are the two programs that have been launched. E-Gram Swaraj, that is related to monitoring of rural infrastructure, and Swamitwa program, which is related to mapping of rural housing and land holdings via technology. So the title for the present article is Wildlife Nod for Mining in Assam Elephant Reserve. The syllabus connection has been listed here. Please have a look. Now let us look into the importance of this article, as in the gist of this article. There are two important things in relation to this particular article. First is to have a background of National Board for Wildlife, and the second thing is to understand what reserve we are talking about, where is it placed, and is it a wildlife sanctuary or a national park or whatever it is. That might figure out in the prelims examination. So these two things are important. So now let's look at the article. So firstly, before we look into the article, we'll first have a brief background about National Board of Wildlife. National Board of Wildlife is basically constituted under Wildlife Protection Act. Under Wildlife Protection Act. This is something really important. In prelims, the question figures out in the following manner. Is it a statutory body or an executive body? First thing, it is constituted under so and so act, and you have to pick whether it is the right option or the wrong option. Now we know that it has been constituted by Wildlife Protection Act of 1972. Why did we constitute it as such? Because we wanted to make sure that wildlife is protected, wildlife is conserved, and in order to do so, we are basically creating a regulatory body called as National Board of Wildlife. What are the powers of this National Board of Wildlife? It is basically having the role of an advisory nature. So it can only give advices. It cannot pass judgments as such. It basically gives advices to the government in order to frame the right kind of policies and measures for the conservation of wildlife. So its prime function is to do what is to help the conservation of wildlife and forests, and in order to do that, it from time to time reviews all the wildlife related matters that are happening in the country. So this is some brief background about National Board of Wildlife. One important fact which I want to identify this from the point of view of prelims is this: there cannot be any alteration of boundaries of protected areas without the approval of the board. That is one important fact. And the second is, it is chaired by the Prime Minister, and it has about 47 members in its board. But that is not relevant, but it is chaired by the Prime Minister is important. So all those bodies which are chaired by the Prime Minister are really important for your prelims examination. In addition to this, it approves projects in and around the national parks and also the wildlife sanctuaries. So this is some brief background about National Board of Wildlife. Having understood this, what is this article trying to tell us? Firstly, this article says in a natural reserve, as in a wildlife sanctuary or a natural reserve, it is called as Saleki Natural Reserve, which is a part of Dehang Patkai Elephant Reserve. This is basically an elephant reserve which is present in a wildlife sanctuary. And where do you find it? You find it in Assam. What is the region basically covered by these particular reserve? This basically covers Sivsagar, Dibrugarh, and Tinsukia. All these three are basically districts in Assam. So all these areas are basically covered by this particular elephant reserve. And in this elephant reserve, Coal India Limited is basically wanting to start a coal mining project. But if you want to start a coal mining project in a forest area, you have to take clearance, because otherwise it is going to hurt the environment. So first you have to take the green clearance, and NBWL is basically giving that clearance. So NBWL, or National Board for Wildlife, has recommended Coal India that it can go on with the proposed coal mining project, but then it has to give a certain blueprint. It has to give the kind of mining it is going to do. It has to give site specific project that it is going to take up. It is also supposed to give the feasibility report for underground mining and so on. So all these things have to be submitted by Coal India Limited. But other than that, for all practical purposes, a nod has been given in order to mine coal in this particular area. That is what this article is trying to tell us. What is relevant for our prelims? Saleki, where is it present? Dehang Patkai Elephant Reserve. Where is this present? Dehang Patkai Elephant Reserve is present in Assam. That is important for us. So that should be the discussion for the day. Thank you for your participation. We'll meet again.